Hi everyone, this is Mr. Swoboda. I have sophomore religion. I'm going to try to read most of this in order to make it shorter. So pardon me while I'm going back and forth between spontaneous comments and reading the paper. I want to talk with you about chapter 9 of Proverbs, and Proverbs we hear is the word about living our life well, which we all want. And we have to deal with some rich imagery and some figurative language and some structure. But here's the basic message. Am I going to be a fool? It's a pretty strong message. Am I going to mess up my life by making poor decisions? Proverbs claims to be a guide for the wise. I know I wish I had read it more carefully and studied it when I was younger. I did read some things, but I really didn't study it. So I'm glad to be going over this with you now, and I hope it's of value to you. First, let's talk structure. There are 3 terms I'd like you to think about and imagine. One is recapitulation, and the other is chiastic structure, and the other is antithetical parallelism. So they're really not as complicated as they sound, so bear with me. First of all, recapitulation, it just means going back to the head, literally. The capit, that Latin root there, means the head. And this is used in music and literature a lot. So whenever the beginning theme is restated again, it's called recapitulation because it's literally going back to the head. It's going back to the first stated theme. So the first thing to think about is that chapter 9 is the last chapter of a series of one story that goes through chapter 1 through 9. And chapter 9 sums up the main points, the heart of the story of chapters 1 through 9. And it does that, so that's how it's a recapitulation. And it's restating the story in a real concentrated and a memorable way. And the basic story is there's these 2 ladies, Lady Wisdom and Lady Folly. And who are we going to follow? So the second thing is that the way this is structured is like an Oreo cookie. So, I think it's so important to use our imaginations, right? Mm-hmm. So imagine there's an Oreo cookie here, and there's a top layer, and there's a bottom layer, and right in the middle there's a cream center, right? And this is the way a chiastic structure in the Bible works. Like there's a top part and a bottom part that are similarly structured, and then there's a middle part that gives the message. And no kidding, if you just keep that in mind and keep thinking about that when you're reading the Bible, very often you will see where is the main message. It's right in the middle, sometimes the chapter or sometimes the section, but that's what we're going to see here in verse 10. So let's go back to the cookie. So the chiastic structure is just it's like a cookie, right? And we're going to do the cream filling at the end. So let's look at this antithetical parallelism. And basically what's going on here is the top part of the cookie looks exactly very similar to the bottom part of the cookie. And that's the parallelism. What's the antithetical? Well, the antithetical is when you bite into the bottom part, it's actually not good for you. So I'm going to read that in a second. But the top part is like chocolatey goodness, and the bottom part looks good, but it's actually poisonous. So think of an Oreo cookie. You've got a beginning and an ending, top and bottom, and then you got something different inside. Here we have a dark, crunchy chocolate cookie, a cream filling in the middle, and here's where the cookie analogy crumbles. Sorry for the pun again. The bottom part of the cookie looks just like the top, but if we make this just like the story, then when you bite into the bottom cookie, you hit this barely digestible, hard, stale thing that is actually icky. Even though it looks good before you bite into it. Another literary term for this, as I said, is chiastic structure. And again, you can think of it sort of like a sandwich, and the power of it is in the structure of it because it really makes us think. Because what do we have to do? We have to compare the top and we have to compare the bottom. And then if we're really on the game, we're going to try to relate the message in the middle both to what comes at the beginning and what comes at the end. Okay, so keeping that in mind, that when we bite into the bottom part, it may look good, but it's actually poisonous. So the top cookie is verses 1 through 9, and that's about Lady Wisdom. And then the bottom cookie is verses 13 to 18 in chapter 9, and that's about Lady Folly. They both do the same things. They both build a house. The house is at the top of the city, beautifully at the top part. They make invitations for people to come in, for the simple who need understanding to come in, and then they offer food and drink. In verse 9, the the Lady Wisdom has built this house with 7 pillars, which I'll talk about in a second, because Lady Folly, she doesn't get 7 pillars. So this beautiful house is up there, but she has maids, and she sends the maids out throughout the city to invite people in. And the maids are saying to all the simple, that means the people who need judgment, who lack judgment, come into Lady Wisdom's house and eat her food and drink her drink. And she says literally, leaving your simple ways, you will, quote, walk in the way of understanding. So let's think about this 7 as completeness. You've got Genesis chapter 1, God creates the world in 6 days, and then there's the 7th day of rest. 7 is completeness, because you've got everything that's in the world, plus you've got God. So, and over again, 7 is one of those numbers that stands for fullness and completeness. Think about that, though, with wisdom. Wisdom is the fullness of understanding. Wisdom is the completeness of understanding. So, also in this chapter and throughout chapters 1 through 8, sexual fidelity is being faithful sexually is repeated, is championed over and over again. And it's contrasted with sexual cheating and how that leads to destruction. And of course, adultery or sexual cheating does a pretty good job destroying marriages. I think we all know that. And then also I want you to think about marriage is not only a theme in chapters 1 through 8 and chapter 9, which I'll explain in a second, but even if you look at the whole book of Proverbs in chapter 31, the very last chapter of Proverbs, the very last section is the qualities of a good wife. And in that chapter, Lady Wisdom is saying, if you marry me, these are the blessings. These are the good things that are going to be happening for you. And let's turn our attention to Lady Folly then. Verses 13 to 18, she also has a house at the top of the city, but she has no maids. She sits at the opening, the gateway to her house by the door, and she invites people into there. And maybe this is a little bit reminiscent, or like the image of the harlot in chapter 7, who's near her house inviting people, trying to seduce people, maybe. But when the young man is approaching the house, she calls him and all of the simple who lack judgment to come in. But what she says is sweet is stolen water. What she says is the best food is, quote, the food eaten in secret. This stands for sexual cheating back at that time, in that context, adultery. And also of the guilt that people feel. So they're not going to be open. They're not going to be in communion. They're going to be doing this in secret. That's because of the guilt that causes them to hide from others. And then the end of chapter 9 is fascinating. It says that her guests are already dead. So I'm going to read it to you. Listen to this. It says, he, that's the person who goes into Lady Folly's house party and eats her food and drinks her drink, he does not know that the dead are there, that her guests are in the depths of Sheol. So this is not saying like, oh, if you lead a life like this, you're going to go to hell. It's not like that at all. It's in the present tense. In other words, the people who are there, they don't realize that the guests that are around them are already in Sheol. Hell is our word. Sheol is an ancient word for like a dark place, a kind of vaguely lighted place where the souls of the dead go. But the point is, if you go into her house and do what she wants you to do, you're already cut off. And think of biblical death. This is like if you think of your religion class, biblical death is being cut off from other people. Biblical death is alienation. Biblical death is just like what happened to Adam and Eve, where they get cut off. No communion with God, no communion with themselves, no communion with each other, no communion with nature. But in all of those relationships, a struggle. And so right there in chapter 9, to say this is the same thing that's going on here. Her guests are already in Sheol. Let's end with the cream center, verses 7 to 12, which is cool because it's positive and it's all about you. So first of all, it challenges the hearer to be wise and not a scoffer or a mocker. If you're a mocker, what that means is that you kind of have this attitude because you mock other people. Well, when somebody goes, or even God goes, to correct you, you would not say, what would make me a better person? You would get angry and you would rebuke that other person, and you are not going to accept correction. But if you're wise, you will accept correction. So that's the first thing she says. And then the heart of the heart, the center of the center, is this verse. She says, quote, The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. That's the whole center of the center. Fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. So you've got that power, and it's the power to choose. And what's it going to be? Are you going to go to the house party provided by Lady Wisdom? Are you going to go to the house party provided by Lady Folly? If you're a mocker, you're going to suffer alone. If you go in with wisdom, your life is going to be blessed. That's about it. So let's ask God to help us be sensitive to the way that Lady Wisdom is inviting us into her house. Let's ask God for the grace to eat the food that she provides and to drink the drink that she provides and to follow God and to keep God's wise teachings as the way that we live so that we'll be able to enjoy life-giving goodness. Amen.